The ruined bakery smelled of ash and stale flour, a thin fog drifting through broken window frames like a promise of things unseen. On the second floor, Michael Donovan pressed his cheek against cold wood and listened. The town of Metz lay folded in early November gray. Shells had hollowed out the streets, and roofs sat like missing teeth against a low, indifferent sky. Time read differently here, each breath measured, each shadow a hypothesis. Donovan's Springfield rested across his knees, the scope a narrow black tunnel that made the world look like a list of things to be struck through. He had learned to read that tunnel as scripture: distance, wind, heartbeat. He had not learned how to keep the rest of the world in view. 2 lines beneath the broken plaster, something had moved. Donovan blinked away the fog in his eyes and nudged the scope. The sight offered the familiar, dangerous certainty of a tube. He thought of James Bradley and Robert Chen, names that had become small punctures in the company roster, and of the tally someone chalked in the supply tent: 23 snipers lost in October alone. The number lived in the mouths of men like weather, impossible to ignore, impossible to change by prayer. It changed by work and courage, and by brusque, often illicit inventions made under the crust of command. They had a problem that would not be solved by orders. German sniper teams were operating in tandem, one hunter at a slit, another covering flank angles. A man who saw through the scope could only see his pipe of view. He could not, without peeking aside, know there was a second shooter at a different angle waiting to end the list of names. That narrowness had a price measured in friends. Donovan felt it in his bones with the same stubborn ache that followed a cold night in foxholes. If you value this kind of story, if you want to remember the forgotten edges of courage, take a moment to like and subscribe, and stay with this account to the moment when a small, seemingly broken thing turned an entire battalion's tactic on its head. Donovan heard the click of a boot below and turned his head. Sam Martinez's face appeared in the doorway, the boy's hair plastered to his forehead by wind and smoke. Sam had the quick luck of a witness, youth sharpened into careful watchfulness. "You see anything?" Sam asked, voice low. Donovan shook his head. Not yet. He did not tell Sam that he saw the ghost of Bradley's grin in the glass of his scope, or that Chen's last look when the round found him had been a question aimed at the ceiling. Why here? Why now? Those questions burned into a man differently than orders did. They made him small and sharp. They were not alone in feeling the burn. Sergeant Frank Wilson moved through the rebel like a man threading a needle, boots clinking on masonry. Wilson carried the blunt, practical authority of someone who had seen too many plans dissolve into blood and mud. He had a way of looking at Donovan that measured both risk and possibility, a look that could be mercy or a summons. "It's the flank angles," Wilson said without preamble when Donovan pulled him aside later that night. "They come in pairs. One draws you, one takes your head when you look." Donovan listened and held a thought like a bird in his hand. He had been a marksman since before the war, a man who could tell the weight of a wind by the whisper it made on a window. He had also worked as a mechanic in peacetime, the sort who fixed radios and axes, and, once, his neighbor's broken spectacles. Hands that knew metal had a stubborn instinct: find what's wrong, make what's missing. He had been moving through ruined buildings, doing that work in the small hours between rest and patrol, and the idea arrived like a tool sliding into its slot. It was not a glorious idea. It was not official. It came from a shaving kit and an excess of tape. At a late-hour gathering in a gutted bakery, Donovan showed the men a small mirror he had pried from a locker, a 4x6 shaving mirror, one edge nicked, the glass already carrying a map of old smudges. He set it on the floor between rusted tins, the reflection catching light like a promise that had not yet learned to be brave. "A mirror," Sam laughed at first, then grew quiet. "For what? Attacking ourselves?" "For seeing what the scope won't," Donovan said. He explained the problem, how a scope, for all its precision, made a man blind to anything beyond its tube. He spoke of angles and of the way a second shooter could slip into the periphery and take a man who had no warning. He spoke, too, of Bradley and Chen, with a tightness in his jaw that prevented sentiment from pooling into pity. The men listened, their expressions folded into something like understanding. The first attempt at makeshift modification was clumsy. Donovan took the razor-thin mirror and cut a strip of scrap metal to make a backing. He shifted the scope mount with careful hands, snugging the mirror against the side of the eyepiece at an angle that promised to catch reflection from the field beside the line of sight. He used cloth and strips of medical adhesive tape from a first aid kit, the tape smelling of antiseptic and old smoke. The mirror sat like an afterthought, small and absurd on the knobby metal of a Springfield. But it changed the geometry of seeing. He explained the principle to Wilson and Sam with the bluntness of a man who had to make generals unnecessary on a bench of rotten wood. If you can't look to one side without losing your crosshairs, let a reflection bring that side into the rim. You don't need to unmount. You don't need to move your head much. You see the flash, you call it, you wait the rhythm. "You're risking a reprimand," Wilson said. "Risk a reprimand," Donovan answered, "or risk another name on the board." They worked in the closeness of night, fingers sticky with tape and oil and frost. Donovan tested the angle by reflecting candlelight through the scope, making tiny adjustments that felt like tuning a stubborn radio. He imagined the Germans' position, how their line of sight would graze the mirror and give away a silhouette or a glint of metal. The mirror would not make a poor shot excellent, but it would buy attention, a fraction of a second that separated life from absence. They had no sanction for such improvisation. Military regulation preferred tidy solutions, doctrine, trials, written proposals. On the front, doctrine arrived too late. Men could not afford the slow justice of committees. So they moved as men always had when faced with the immediate, quietly, with a shared understanding that the worst scrutiny came from surviving another day. The first field test came at dawn, when fog still lay fat in the streets and the cold made breath a mist that did not quite belong to the living. Donovan climbed to the same bakery window with the modified Springfield. Sam waited a floor below, fingers on the cold iron of a support beam. The town did not announce itself, it breathed. Donovan looked through the scope and, as he had predicted, the tunnel of sight gave him a precise, dangerously narrow reading of the opposite square. He saw one man in a slit, part of a ruined facade, movement precise and slow as a metronome. The mirror lived up to its promise. At the edge of the scope, where vision normally ended, the mirror caught a darker blur. It was a movement that would not have registered until it was too late. The second man stepping to a flank, his muzzle peering between a broken column. Donovan's throat tightened with the strange mixture of cold and clarity that accompanied threat. He did not have to turn. The reflection gave him the angle and a rough sense of distance. He called it low to Sam. "Second at 2 o'clock, 30 yards. Sam answered like a practiced instrument, steady and dry. "Copy." The engagement that followed was quick. Donovan squeezed the trigger for the man in the slit. The sound was thunder in the chest. The recoil bit the shoulder in a way that made the breath hitch. Before the second shooter could come to his full posture, the mirrored image gave Donovan the cue. He adjusted, let the crosshair rest on the reflected outline, and fired again. 2 confirmed kills, simultaneous in effect, though not in the law of arms. The relief hit the men like a physical thing, sharp and almost vertiginous. They had not invented certainty, but they had stolen a margin. Afterward, as the fog thinned and the sun stained the town in a brittle yellow, the small mirror on Donovan's rifle looked ridiculous, like a child's toy. Yet it had changed a moment, and moments were what lines of men accrued into survival.
Word travels quickly in foxholes and ruins, and it travels in tongues that do not always care for the shape of orders. Sergeant Wilson began to adopt the practice for his pair of marksmen. He found mirrors where he could. The edge of a pocket shaving kit here, a broken signal reflector scavenged there. He taught the adjustment with blunt authority. This angle, that tape, don't be obvious. Captain Robert Hayes, who commanded the company, preferred order but had an eye for practicality. Hayes had seen enough to know that the best leaders sometimes had to look away from regulation to keep men alive. When Hayes inspected the line and noticed that several rifles bore the same odd, absurd fixture, he did not immediately call it treason. He watched them in action during a daylight positioning, his brow folding the way it did when a problem was not theoretical but lethal. Hayes ordered a quiet report back to battalion command and, more cautiously, flagged the modification for testing. He argued, in words that smelled of responsibility rather than politics, that if something worked at the company level, it deserved examination rather than punishment. It was a dangerous step for Donovan. Men who made field changes risked censure. Sometimes the Army's machinery crushed inventiveness in the name of uniformity. Donovan did not write a letter asking for commendation. He did not seek parade ribbons. He wanted the men around him to stop dying. He wanted to keep his evenings from being punctured by names. Before the infantry could diffuse the method widely, the company underwent another spate of engagements. The mirror had a learning curve. Early adopters made mistakes, angles too sharp, and reflections that revealed their own shadows. Men who forgot to clean the glass and lost a critical glint. There were nights when the mirror did little more than give a false sense of security. But there were other nights, enough to count, when the reflected image saved a flank, or allowed a man to see a movement in his blind spot and call it before death could turn a life into a ledger entry. Not all innovation scales cleanly. The mirror was low-tech. Its genius lay in geometry, not metallurgy or doctrine. Hayes arranged for 2 men from the battalion staff to take field notes and forward a request for evaluation to the regimental proving ground. The platoon sergeant's report was frank. The device had a measurable effect on survivability in urban, constrained sightlines. They documented when and where it had been used and correlated those engagements with casualty rates. The numbers were stubborn but hopeful. In the months before Donovan's idea, the company had lost 23 snipers in October. After the ad hoc adoption, through November, the patterns shifted enough to attract the attention of those who thought in reports. Yet attention did not equal credit. The Army's records were good at absorbing facts and indifferent to the names of the men who had first stumbled on them. For Donovan, the safest reward came not from brass or ribbons, but from the look on Sam Martinez's face the morning after their first successful use. Relaxed, exhausted, grateful in a way that could not be written into a report. Martinez pressed a cigarette between his fingers and said, "You kept me alive, Mike." Donovan only nodded. Praise was a dangerous thing. It attracted notice that could, in other hands, twist into paperwork. Still, the small ripple of gratitude traveled. Men told other men. A sergeant in one company would borrow a mirror from a nurse and fit it with care on a borrowed rifle. Another man would learn to do the same at night, under a dark roof, treating the act like prayer. By late November, the battalion was using the mirror in urban sectors as a standard practice, not because a general had ordered it, but because company commanders saw less attrition on their rosters. Captain Hayes pushed for formal testing. The Proving Ground Detachment came and collected the rifles, the mirrors, the witness statements. They set up controlled ranges, measured angles of reflection, recorded how often a reflected silhouette registered early enough to change the outcome. An ordnance team performed cold, meticulous math. Their report was careful and clinical. In constrained urban sightlines, a small reflective surface mounted judiciously to a telescopic sight could increase the probability of detecting a second shooter by a meaningful margin. Those were the words papers liked: probability, margin, measurement. For the men in the ruins, they translated into something more tactile: a fraction of a second, a call, a life. The proving ground recommended further trials and a consideration for doctrinal inclusion. But institution moves like a glacier. It takes years, committees, demonstrations away from the places where bodies pile up in listable numbers. In the months after the recommendation, the practice spread through the regiment and later into other units by demonstration and rumor. Soldiers taught soldiers. The mirror became a secret common good, a small conspiracy against loss. Estimations came later from historians who pieced together action reports and survivor accounts. A mid-range estimate placed lives saved because of this modification in the range of 40 to 60 across the theater where such tactics were used. Numbers like that were both modest and enormous. Each life saved contained names, laughter, futures that did not end under foreign rafters. Donovan did not put his name in any of the early reports. He kept his days uncluttered by the hope of renown, and his nights were given to small rituals: cleaning the mirror before patrol, kneading dough in camps where cooks tried to summon kitchens from rations, answering letters from home in his cramped, drafty handwriting. After the war, he returned to a quieter life, a man whose shoulders had learned the weight of
both grief and design. He worked in a factory, fixed radios and stoves, married, and talked little about the things that had smelled of cordite and damped wood. He died in 2001, a veteran whose name did not headline histories, but whose choices bent the curve of many lives. There was no single moment of triumph. There was, instead, a long unwinding of consequence. Men living because another had turned his head from regulation to what was urgent. And yet, even with the Proving Grounds recommendation, credit proved slippery. The Army adopted the practice in doctrine through a cautious footnote, and technical descriptions smoothed away the identity of the man who first tested the mirror on a ruined bakery window. Official reports favored lineage and formal trials. Field improvisation lived in margins of memos. For decades, the mirror remained a quiet, dirty secret in veterans' hands and photographs. The story might have ended with that bureaucratic erasure if not for one quieter force: memory kept by the men who had stood beside Donovan and by a historian much later who pulled threads from service records, letters, and a rusted rifle on display at a small county museum. The historian, methodical, patient, with a love for the small evidence that carries large truth, found a scrap of correspondence noting the modification and the man who had first crafted it. He cross-referenced depositions and oral histories. In 1998, a short paper circulated quietly among scholars of ordnance innovation, naming Michael Donovan among those who had moved practice before the forms caught up. That posthumous attention changed little for official medal rolls, but everything in tenderness. It allowed veterans like Sam Martinez to say publicly what they had been saying privately for half a century, that a small, broken mirror had been a match for a deadly geometry. Donovan's mirror would later make its way, oddly and appropriately, into the glass case of a regional museum. The exhibit labeled the rifle's modification as an example of field ingenuity. The placard offered measured language, dates, and a historian's note. People stopped sometimes to look: school children on organized tours, old comrades who traced the outline of the glass with a fingertip, a grandson who had never met the man whose name he now read, paired with a brief caption. Standing before that rifle, it was easy to see the mirror as a symbol: the small tool reflecting possibilities, the sideways glance that makes the blind spot visible. But symbols flatten lives if they are left alone. Behind the object were hands, frost, fear, and the muffled conversations of men who did not have institutional patience but had urgency enough to alter outcomes. That was Donovan's legacy: not a patent, not a parade, but a modest, stubborn recalibration of sight. On a damp evening in November during the war, after one of the first successful uses, Donovan returned to the bakery window with Sam at his side. The town was quieter than usual. Smoke lay low, and the men were more watchful than talkative. Sam looked at Michael and said simply, "You ever regret it?"
Donovan held the mirror between his fingers, feeling the nicked edge that had always worried him. "Regret?" he repeated, as if the word were a shape he had to turn for light. "Only that I couldn't do more, only that it took losing boys for me to do it." Sam did not answer. There was nothing to say that could make the lost names return to life. There was instead the small consolation of utility, the fact that other men might sleep a little longer and live to write letters home. That, for Donovan, was enough to breathe with. The question that haunted him as winter pressed in was not whether the mirror worked. That had been proven in the dust of the square. But whether something so plain could endure beyond the ruined town, beyond the immediate calculus of survival. Would the proven ground's measurements translate into doctrine? Would the Army's machinery, which moved slowly and without passion, carry the detail of a man's life into the ledger of tactics? And if it did, would the name attached be his, or simply a footnote in formal language? He did what he had always done. He kept turning small screws and watching how the world shifted one fraction at a time. The mirror remained on his rifle, a little crooked, like a smile that had learned not to ask permission. Donovan left the war with hands that remembered cold and the precise bite of a screwdriver better than they remembered the warmth of a stove. He settled in a town that had not been spared from the map of conflict, but had been spared its worst edges. Roofs intact, a butcher who still knew how a man liked his beef, a school with a slateboard where children learned to write the same letters that had been scrawled on ration cards. He took up work as a repairman, first in a garage with oil dark as old language, and then in a small shop behind his house where he fixed everything that moved or creaked: radios with loose tubes, clocks that ran 5 minutes fast, lawnmowers that coughed like old men. People brought him things not because he promised miracles, but because he was patient with small mechanisms. He liked the quiet architecture of bolts and hinges. They would not betray him with quick judgments. At night he kept the mirror wrapped in an oilcloth, then in a cigar tin, then in the pocket of a jacket that had grown thin at the elbow. Sometimes he would take it out and hold it to the light, watching its edge catch a sliver of the kitchen lamp. It reflected the narrow room, stacks of unpaid bills, a photograph of a woman with hair the color of late wheat, a child asleep with a faucet of light on his face. Donovan never framed the photograph or told stories to fill the
empty spaces in it. Instead, he learned to make small repairs to other people's homes and to listen when neighbors came by with news that was mostly the weather and occasionally the kind of grief that needed no explanation. Letters arrived sporadically. One from a mother who wrote to say that her son had come home because he had been missed, because an obscure angle of sight had turned a bullet aside. Another from a lieutenant who sent a metal ribbon that Donovan pinned in the drawer and did not wear. Donovan replied with a few folded sentences and a hand-drawn schematic of a hinge, the kind of thing he thought people might actually use. He refused offers to explain the mirror to officers who wanted formal demonstrations. It did what it had to, he said once to a captain, and left before the man could thank him properly. He married the woman in the photograph. They planted a small vegetable patch and argued once, briefly, about the color of paint on the porch. They had one child, a son, who would not be strong in the arm the way Donovan had hoped, but who had a steady mind and later took up a trade in teaching. When the town began to change, new stores with glass fronts, a road that bypassed the main street, Donovan retreated into the mechanics he understood. He kept his mouth shut about the war in the way men keep certain drawers closed, not out of shame so much as habit. To talk often meant to be asked for more than one could give. Years folded into each other. The mirror was carried from pocket to pocket, from drawer to tin box, and once into a cardboard carton that sat beside a rusted toolbox for decades. Donovan died with his hands folded on his chest, as if in the middle of tightening a bolt in prayer. His funeral was small. The town came in numbers large enough to matter, but not to make news.
Sam Martinez read something that Donovan would have nodded at, short words about service and common courage. And later at the wake, veterans lingered near the liquor and coffee and said, in the way veterans do, that he had been a good man. The Mirror made the trip to the museum in pieces. It had been found folded into a newspaper in a box labeled Personal Effects. The grandson, Daniel, child of Donovan's son, was young then, and when people asked him about his grandfather, he looked at the photograph and said he fixed things. That was both enough and not enough. Daniel grew up with a certainty that his grandfather had been plain and useful, and sometimes not present in the wondrous way of heroes. He learned to repair a bicycle and to take apart and put together a clock, mostly because the motions felt like a conversation he had missed. The historian worked slowly, with the particular patience of someone who believes the past yields itself.
Only to persistent fingers. He read minutes, scanned muster rolls, traced shifts in inventory ledgers. He found in a ledger labeled Provisional Equipment a smudge of handwriting that might have been a name, M. Donovan. He found a page in a soldier's letter where a man wrote of a trick with glass that turned the angles so the hunter could not find us. He paced the museums and county rooms, knocked on doors, bought a beer and a seat in the bar at the American Legion, and listened. From fragments he assembled a trajectory. One man, a mirror, a rifle altered in the cold of a ruined square. When the paper finally appeared in 1998, it did not shout. It was modestly footnoted and polite in its conclusions. But among a small circle of ordnance scholars and a handful of veterans, the paper resonated like a bell that had been hidden under a bushel and lifted. Sam Martinez, older then, had kept the truth like a dry ember in his pocket. When the historian found him and asked if he would speak, Sam agreed with the half-smile of a man who had been carrying a story and was finally allowed to set it down. He told the others about the night the mirror had mattered, about lights that were too close, about the way a silhouette could be misread, about the sensation of safety when before there had been only the mathematics of risk. He spoke without flourish. People leaned in because veterans tend to speak slowly about what is urgent. The museum, modest and serious, scheduled an unveiling of the exhibit that would include the rifle and the tiny chipped mirror. Daniel, who had at last become curious about the man in the photograph on his grandmother's mantel, came. He walked the room with his hands pressed behind his back, like a child at a funeral who does not wish to cry. Sam was there, his hair white and his voice steady. The historian stood with a folder of photocopies and a pair of reading glasses that kept falling to the end of his nose. There were a few reporters, mostly from the local paper, and a smattering of school children who would later be quizzed on the field trip. The curator read the placard aloud, a careful paragraph that honored ingenuity and noted dates and units. The historian added a sentence about the archive trail, the fragments that made up a life. Sam stepped forward then and spoke without notes. He did not claim Donovan's acts as poetry. He described them as obedience to the need of a man beside him. He didn't want medals, Sam said. He wanted boys at home. He wanted us to be safe enough to write letters. He looked at Daniel as he spoke, and in that look there was an acknowledgment that the past could be a gift, slow and small, passed down like a tool still worn at the handle. Daniel touched the glass of the case. He saw his own face in it, warped slightly by age and the curve of the display. The mirror caught the light of the gallery and threw it back, as if insisting that every line in his face had once been visible in another man's hands. He leaned closer and found, in the scratch that had worried Donovan for years, the faint memory of a nick from a battlefield. It was no longer merely an object. It was a bridge between nights he had never lived and mornings his son might yet know. That evening after the unveiling, Sam and Daniel walked out into the cold. Streetlights stood like lamps over distant hills. They did not speak at first. Then Daniel asked, simply, "Did he ever tell you why he did it?" Sam looked up at the sky, and then at the shadow of Donovan's house across the street. He didn't say much, he answered, but when you see how men go about their work, how some fix what's broken and some hide from the sound, sometimes you don't need words. You know him by what he left. That's enough. Daniel held the memory of that night like a small tool to be used later. He would not become a historian or a soldier. He would teach like his father, and in a classroom he would tell a student that a man who fixed things could also change what it means to see. The mirror, meanwhile, sat in its case, its edge catching light and folding it back into the room. Children pressed their noses to the glass. An old comrade traced the outline and remembered the frost. The historian filed another photocopy and looked for the next small truth to assemble. In the weeks that followed, letters came to the museum, notes of thanks, a brief recollection from a widow of a repaired roof, a draft from a distant family member who had read the paper and wanted to know the whereabouts of a simple name. The presence of Donovan's mirror in a public place made possible a series of small reckonings. A man who had been silent received acknowledgement. Veterans who had carried the secret of an improvised solution let it be voiced. But the truest proofs were private. An old neighbor saying, "I always liked his hands." A grandson learning the rhythm of a screwdriver. An officer filing an after-action report that would, decades later, be cited not as doctrine but as human evidence that systems are made by men who insist. On a night when the rain flattened the town into a sheet of glass, Daniel stood by his own window and held a photograph of his grandfather. The image was the same as it had been for years. Donovan with a quiet jaw, a shirt collar rough from labor. Daniel placed the photograph beside a small mirror he had inherited, and in the reflected light he saw the lineage of hands and the stubborn, modest duty that had threaded them together. Outside, the museum's windows held their own pale view of the street, and inside, under the lamp, the rifle's modification waited for visitors who might look and perhaps see the angle that changed a course of nights. The mirror had done its small work again. It made a blind spot visible. It did not erase the cost, nor did it offer a clean ledger of heroism. It refracted the truth, fragmented and necessary, and left, in the space between the glass and the hand, room enough for the living to step toward one another. A week after the rain, the museum rang with the small habitual noises of a place made of paper and glass. The scratch of a pencil on accession forms, the soft clack of heels in the archive, the measured thunk of a crate lid being lowered into storage. Daniel came in early, more out of habit than obligation. He lingered by Donovan's case until the sunlight slanted in and pooled on the floor like a pale coin. Children would not press their noses to the glass today. A school trip had moved on to the natural history wing. The museum felt, for a few hours, like the private room of a house. The curator found him there. She was carrying a padded envelope, the sort the archive used for fragile photographs. Her face had a tired civility that was mostly kindness. "This arrived with the letters," she said. "We thought you should see it first." Daniel took the envelope with hands that remembered a drill's vibration. On the outside, a name was written in Donovan's blocky hand, Dr., and beneath it, in a smaller scrawl, for Daniel. They stepped to a back table. The curator set the envelope down and, for want of an audience, cleared her throat. "We weren't sure whether to open it," she said. "Sometimes families want things filed without public reading. But this," she tapped the flap, "this came unsecured, with no return address. It looked like he meant it to be read." Daniel slit the edge. Inside, folded once, lay a sheet of notepaper browned at the corners. The pen marks were the same careful shorthand of a man who had learned to write his thoughts between shifts in the pause of a day. There were 3 paragraphs, no flourish. They read like the directions Donovan had once given a neighbor on how to set a fence post. Direct, necessary, untendered, but not cruel. "If you are reading this, then someone trusted me to tell you the small parts," it began. "I did what I could. I did not ask for more than a roof and a letter. And yet—" The second paragraph paused, a margin of silence in ink.
There was one night when a boy needed a ladder and there was none where I could find it. I made what I had make one. I am not a soldier. I am a man who
keeps his hands working. If what I did helped another sleep, then I kept something of the world whole. If it did other things, that was not my intent, and for the things I did not intend, forgive me. The last line was a sentence about tools. Teach the hands, it said, not the hero. Teach the hands how to oil the screw, how to look at a problem and name it. Name the cost, too, when it comes. Don't let them think the tool forgives the user. Daniel read the note twice, then a third time, as if the repetition might reveal a hidden clause, a map to abstraction that would license a simpler grief. There was no map. There was only a man speaking in the language he knew: work, mitigation, small repair. Sam watched him with his hands in his coat pockets, not intruding, not asking the kind of question that would make confession theatrical. Around them the hum of the museum carried on. A couple arguing softly over an exhibit label, an intern returning a tray of postcards. "It's short," the curator said, gently, "but he wrote it to you." Daniel folded the paper back along the crease, feeling the weight of the ink as if it were a physical thing. The note did not answer every question. It did not provide absolution, nor did it demand it. What it did do was place Donovan again in the frame he had always occupied. A man of hands, liable to make a ladder from nothing because a ladder would make a child safer. The confession and the defense were the same motion. He wanted this in the open, Sam said at last. Whether he knew the museum would be the place or not, he wanted someone to look at what he did, and at how it was done. "What do we do with that?" the curator asked. Daniel thought of the rifle's modification in the display, of the way its edge bent light and set a new pattern of seeing on the room. He thought of the children pressing their faces to the glass and learning, in the way children learn, that objects carry stories heavier than their weight. "Teach the hands," he said aloud, and the phrase felt like the key Donovan had left under a doormat. He pictured his future classroom, a chalkboard, a row of benches, the slant of afternoon sun, and knew suddenly what the note required of him. Not a defense of the deed, but an insistence on a kind of pedagogy that did not erase consequence. They placed the note into the accession file. The curator made a photocopy for the archive, and the original was sealed in a conservation sleeve. For the public label, they added, after some deliberation, a sentence that Donovan would have recognized. "A craftsman's solution, left to stand beside the ordinary needs of home." It was careful wording. It refused to be a verdict. The historian wrote an addendum, the museum newsletter that described the note and invited correspondence. The town responded, as towns will, in fragments. A man at the post office saying he was always fixing my mower. A woman at the library who remembered his careful hat tilts when he stepped around a puddle. A nephew who sent a grainy photograph of Donovan at a workbench, his hands ink dark and calm. Daniel did not return to the museum every day, but he began to carry a small thing with him into his life, a tightened attention to how he taught seeing. When he stood before his students, he did not begin with the grand narratives of history or the technical blueprints of instruments. He brought a mirror. It was a pocket mirror, not striking, the kind one keeps in a drawer for checking collars. He had found it at the back of Donovan's toolbox, wrapped in an old rag. He set it on his desk and asked the class to look into it. Young faces, some bored, some open as new pages, leaned in. "What do you see?" he asked. Eyes moved, registered, answered in small truths. A girl talked about a missing tooth. A boy mentioned a scar on his eyebrow. Someone said they saw the classroom light. No one said history at first. Daniel held the mirror so they could see what came back. Someone looking back, unvarnished. He used the moment to teach a method, to look at things as tools with effects, to hold the reflection and consider not what it makes you become, but what it reveals that was already there. He taught them how a screwdriver's head, worn flat by use, told the story of the things it had touched.
He set aside a lesson to discuss consequence with the same gravity he would give to torque tables. A tool is not a truth, he told them. A tool changes what is possible. That means you must think before you hand it over. There was compassion in the lesson, but not sentimentalization. He read to them the lines from Donovan's note, then asked what the phrase, "name the cost," meant in their lives. Hands shot up. Students who had grown up with fathers who worked at night spoke of the sound of engines. Others of the absence of a parent at breakfast. Outside of class, the town's conversations hardened and softened in waves. A columnist wrote an essay about manufactured heroes and the museum's duty to avoid romanticizing ambiguous acts. In the letters page, a woman wrote back about the nights her husband returned because a neighbor had braced a ladder. Reporters came, furtive and polite, seeking angles, technical diagrams, interviews with veterans, the thrill of revelation. Daniel declined most requests. He walked the line between openness and the need to protect the integrity of the thing Donovan had left. A single, human attempt to make a small corner of the world safer. On a bright Thursday, an old comrade of Donovan's
visited the museum. He was small and stooped, a man with the stubborn gait of someone who had leaned on his knees through winters. He pressed his palm to the glass and stayed with the exhibit until the guard spoke with a deferential firmness and pointed him to a chair. He smelled faintly of tobacco and oil. When Daniel approached, the man looked up and smiled without teeth. "We did what we had to," he said. He didn't like the word hero. He liked the word fix. His voice was a dry thing that nevertheless carried a kind of soft wonder. He told me once, "If you can make a ladder, you make a way for someone else to climb. Simple as that." "And were you afraid?" Daniel asked, because the question had the directness of a classroom exercise, something practical to examine. The old man's laugh was a quick, embarrassed thing. Always afraid. Every man is. But he'd put his hands where his fear was and try to make the fear smaller for others. That's what he taught me. He lifted his fingers and tapped the glass, as if affirming a point. Teach the hands, boy, not to worship them, mind you. Teach them to be careful. Daniel felt something settle then, not peace so much as a permission to continue the labor he had chosen, to teach without simplifying, to honor workmanship while naming cost. That night he sat at his kitchen table and wrote a syllabus that began with the sentence Donovan had used and ended with an assignment. Students would be required to produce an object that solved a need and then write an account of the consequences, intended and otherwise. The week after, he watched as a shy student mounted a simple wooden step for the classroom's narrow shelf and then wrote, with surprising frankness, about how the same step could be used in ways the student had not intended. The class discussed it, nervously and honestly. Letters continued to arrive, some small, grateful, practical, others more searching, asking for explanations the museum could not give. They drifted into the same file where Donovan's note rested, and sometimes Daniel would open the drawer and let his fingers pass over the sealed sleeve as a way to steady himself. The mirror in its case caught light the way it always had, folding daylight into the room. In that folded light, Donovan's work remained a shape people could learn to look at from different angles. There was no final judgment in the town. No one vanished into shame, and no one rose to triumphant absolution. Life, as it tends to, continued with its small reckonings. Men fixed roofs. Children learned the names of tools. The museum scheduled a public talk, and Daniel agreed to speak, not to pronounce verdicts, but to teach a mode of attention he believed Donovan would have recognized, to look, to make, and to name what was made, with clarity. On the evening of the
gallery filled with the low tide of the town. Neighbors, a few veterans, a stray reporter, and the curator with her careful civility. Sam sat at the back with a notebook. Daniel mounted the small stage, and for a breath he felt the precise anxiety of leaning over a bench to tighten a bolt. He opened his talk with the pocket mirror Donovan had kept in his rag, held it up so everyone could see the small, common reflection it offered, and then placed it on the podium. "Donovan taught me something simple," he said. "He taught me that a thing can make visible what we had only guessed at. But that visibility does not mean the thing was good or bad in itself. It means we must choose what to do with what we see." He spoke of hands, of consequences, of the responsibility of the maker. He read Donovan's note aloud, and in the pause that followed felt the room gather. When he finished, someone at the edge of the crowd asked what he thought Donovan would have wanted, to be judged or to be understood. Daniel paused. The answer that rose was not a neat absolution. He would have wanted the next person to know how to make a ladder, he said, and the next person to think about whether they should hand it over. Applause came, steady and modest. Outside, the streetlights cut the town into pools. The mirror in the exhibit caught one of those pools and sent it back as a bright, uncertain shape. Daniel walked home with Sam at his side, and they moved through the dark with the quiet comfort of two people who knew the difference between seeing and deciding. The work of teaching stretched out before Daniel like a bench he would sit at each day, necessary, honest, and unending. He had a note, a mirror, and the steady knowledge that hands could build a world, and that a world's moral shape was measured, in part, by what those hands had learned to ask of themselves.